There's a place in the mountains of southwestern Montana where two cliffs of black rock lean close and pinch the daylight down to a gray ribbon, and the floor between them never sees the sun. Even at noon, it holds the blue cold of evening. Frost furs every stone. Under a skin of ice, water ticks somewhere out of sight, patient and small, the only sound in the whole dead place. A young woman stands at the mouth of it, breath smoking, a rope-handled trunk dragged behind her through the frozen stream bed. She has spent nearly everything she owns to be here. She looks up, 50 feet above the floor, behind a curtain of dead vines. There's one rectangle of bare, dark stone where the frost will not hold. Birgit Stensland had $5.80, and until sunset to be gone. The man who owned the wash house stood in the doorway with a hammer in one hand and a fistful of iron nails in the other, waiting for her to carry out the last of it. Her employer had died in the night, owing 4 months' rent. The owner had already hauled off the copper boiler against the debt, and the boiler was the only thing in the building worth hauling. Birgit was not worth hauling. She was told to have her trunk out before dark. After dark, the door would be nailed shut, and whatever remained inside would belong to him. $5.80. A bed at the boarding house ran $0.75 a week, and that was before meals. The ferries to her mother's people cost more than everything in her purse, and there was no money waiting at the far end of that road, only another mouth nobody had asked for. Split wood sold by the cord at a price that made her laugh once, out loud in the cold. Winter was perhaps 5 weeks off. She had no horse. She could not carry enough wood on her back to last a single week, let alone a season, and there was no one, anywhere, who owed her a roof. She dragged the trunk to the edge of the plank walk and sat on it. The sleet had started an hour before, fine and gray, the kind that did not fall so much as gather on a person. Behind her, the hammer began its work. 3 blows, a pause, 3 blows. She counted the nails going into the frame of the only place she had slept for 2 years, and did not turn around to watch. Her husband had been dead 11 months, 18 months of marriage, and then a shaft in the Alder district let go while he was under it, and the wages he was owed for that quarter went somewhere between the paymaster's ledger and the ground. She had gone to the mining office twice. A clerk had shown her a column of figures and a note that said the account was closed, and closed was closed. She had learned that word the way a person learns the shape of a stone, by tripping on it in the dark. So she knew, sitting on the trunk in the sleet, exactly how much a young widow was worth in Virginia City in October of 1886. She was worth the trunk under her and nothing more. She could read a ledger. She could do sums in her head faster than the men who kept the books, a thing she had learned to hide because it made them uneasy. She could stand at a wash tub 12 hours and not sit down. None of it added up to a place to be when the temperature dropped, and it would drop. Everyone in the territory could feel it coming. The old men said the cattle were growing their winter coats early and heavy, and the old men were rarely wrong about that. Birgit picked up one handle of the trunk and dragged it down the street toward the one office in town that dealt in the buying and selling of ground. The county recorder kept his room above the assay office, up a flight of outside stairs slick with the same gray sleet. She hauled the trunk to the bottom of the stairs, left it there, and went up. Inside, a stove ticked and 3 men stood near it, warming their hands and talking about beef prices. She knew one of them, and everyone knew Milo Danner. Danner owned the livery on the south end of town, and Danner owned bits of things all over the county, claims and lots and slivers of other men's failures that he picked up cheap and held until they were worth something, or until he grew bored of paying the paper on them. He was a broad man with a soft voice, and the soft voice was the dangerous part. He turned when she came in and looked her over the way he looked over a horse he did not intend to buy. Mrs. Stensland, he said. I heard about the wash house. Hard luck. I need somewhere to be, she said. She did not have the strength left for anything but the plain thing. Danner's face did something that was almost kindness and was not. It happens, he said, that I have got a piece of ground I would let go cheap, recorded and everything, legal as church. The recorder, a thin man named Petrie, looked up from his desk and said nothing, which told Birgit something on its own. What ground? She said. The Warm Shadow Mill site, out at Black Glass Gorge, 14 miles or so on the Bannock Road. Danner said the name easily, the way a man says a name he wants to sound ordinary. 4 8/10 acres. There is a shed foundation on it, cliff behind, and a cart track, more or less. Somebody meant to run a stamp mill out there years back and never did. The paper is clean. It is yours for $5, and I throw in the recorder's fee out of my own pocket, because I am a Christian man, and it is a cold day. One of the other men by the stove made a sound in his nose. Why would you sell ground for $5? Birgit said. Because the assessments come due, and I am tired of paying them on a hole in the rocks nobody wants. Danner spread his hands. I am doing us both a favor. You get a deed. I get shed of it. She should have heard the thing under the words. She was too cold and too tired to hear it. She heard only the one word that mattered, which was deed, and a deed meant a place no one could nail shut against her in the morning. That was when Orson Kittredge spoke from the corner. She had not noticed him, an old man with a surveyor's satchel and a straight back, 61 years old, and every one of them spent measuring the ground other men gambled on. He had been the superintendent of 2 mines before his knees gave out, and now the county paid him to walk lines and settle disputes and tell people the truth about dirt, which was a job that made no friends. Let me see the description, Kittredge said. Petrie handed it across. Kittredge read it the way a doctor reads a chart, and when he set it down, his face had closed. Girl, he said, and the word was not unkind, only final. That gorge faces north between 2 walls near 200 feet high. It gets no winter sun. None. There's no timber stand on it worth the name, and the timber you would need to raise even a small cabin, and the stove to heat it, and the wood to feed the stove, would cost you more money than you will earn in 3 years of washing shirts. He tapped the paper once. A body needs 6 cords of dry wood to hold a small cabin through a Montana winter. 6, if the cabin is tight, and a first cabin is never tight. You've got $5. Wood is climbing to 8 a cord, and it will hit 12 before Christmas. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that might have been pity and might have been only accuracy. You paid $5 for a grave with a deed. That is what you would be doing. I have surveyed that ground. I'm telling you as a man who knows it. The room was quiet. The stove ticked. Birgit looked at the description in Petrie's hand. 4 8/10 acres, a cliff, a track. She thought about the nails going into the wash house door, 3 blows and a pause. She thought about the boarding house at $0.75 a week that she could pay for 8 days and then not pay. No? Do the ghosts charge rent? Said the man by the stove, and the other one laughed. Birgit counted 5 silver dollars out of her purse into Milo Danner's open palm, one at a time, so that everyone in the room could hear each one land. Then she asked Petrie where she signed. She had 80 cents left when she walked back down the icy stairs. The gorge took her most of the day to reach on foot. The trunk left with Nell Brackett at the boarding house because Nell was the one person in the county who had never once looked at her like a thing to be hauled off. The Bannock Road ran west, and then the track to the gorge broke off it, and the track was as bad as Danner had said, worse, rutted and washed, and finally not a track at all but a dry stream bed that a wagon could not have followed. Then the walls closed in, and she understood the name. Black Glass Gorge was a wound in the earth. Two cliffs of dark rock leaned toward each other with a strip of gray sky pinched between them, and the floor of it never saw the sun this time of year, so that even at midday it held the blue cold of evening. Frost furred every stone. Ice skinned the pools where the stream bed still held water, and beneath the ice the water ticked, a small patient sound, the only living thing she could hear. She stood at the mouth of it, with her breath smoking, and thought, he was right. The old surveyor was right. I have bought a grave. She almost turned around. She did not, because there was nowhere to turn around to. So she walked in, over the frost and the ice-skinned pools, past the crumbled foundation of the mill shed that some hopeful man had laid and abandoned, deeper into the cold between the walls, looking for any reason at all to believe she had not thrown away her last $5. And halfway along, where the north wall rose sheerest, she saw the thing that stopped her. Frost lay over everything. It lay on the stones and the dead grass and the fallen timber and the cliff face itself, a white skin on the whole dead world. But high up the wall, perhaps 60 feet above the gorge floor, a curtain of dead vines hung down the rock, and beneath that curtain, in a rough rectangle the size of a doorway, there was no frost at all. The stone there was bare, dark, wet even, where the frost around it was dry. Something behind that rock was warm. Birgit Stensland stood at the bottom of the cliff with her neck bent back and her heart going hard, and for the first time since the washhouse door she felt something that was not despair. She did not have a word for it yet. She only knew that in a gorge where everything else had surrendered to the cold, one small square of rock was refusing. She had grown up beside a quarry. Her father had spent 30 years breaking stone, and he had taught her, without meaning it as a lesson, that stone remembers where water has traveled, and that warm rock in a cold place is never an accident. She could hear him as if he stood beside her. Feel here, Birgit, under the grit. What is that? That, she thought, was heat coming out of the ground. The climb nearly killed her before she learned anything from it. He went up the next morning at first light, because she had spent the night in the mill foundation wrapped in both her wool blankets and had not slept, and because she could not bear to look at that bare rectangle of stone one more hour without knowing what lay behind it. There were holds in the cliff, she saw now, and they were not natural. Shallow rectangular cuts stepped up the rock, half filled with mineral scale and hidden under the vines, the kind of cuts a man makes with a hand chisel when he wants a way up a cliff and does not want it seen. Someone had made a stair here long ago, and then let the vines swallow it. She climbed with her father's folding rule in her apron pocket and her hammer through her belt, and her damaged left wrist screaming at every pull. The wrist had never healed right after 2 years of wringing wet wool, and 40 feet up, when a hold crumbled to grit under her boot, it was the bad wrist that took her whole weight for one long swinging moment, while her feet scrabbled at nothing, and the gorge floor waited below her like an open hand. She got a knee onto the next cut. She hung there shaking and did not look down again. 58 feet up, by the reckoning she made later with the rule, she pulled herself onto a ledge, tore the dead vines aside, and found the door. Not a door, a portal. A mine cut, squared by human hands, about 3 feet wide and 5.5 high, framed once with timber that had rotted to soft black splinters. She could see the sockets where a plank door had hung, and she understood in one cold rush that this had been made to be hidden. The vines, the concealed stair, the door long gone to rot. Someone had wanted this hole in the rock to stay a secret. She struck a match against the stone and went in. The passage ran back into the dark, so narrow in places she had to turn her shoulders sideways to pass a fall of timber, 36 feet of it by the rule, and with every foot 2 things changed. The light died behind her, and the air grew warm, not warm like a room, warmer than it had any right to be. Outside, the morning stood at 31 degrees. She'd left a tin of water on the ledge, and it had a skin of ice. Here in the passage, the cold let go of her face. She stopped, put her bare palm flat against the wall, and felt her father's lesson answer her under the grit. The stone was warm, deeper in, warmer still. She should have been afraid. She was, a little. But she had watched the candle stub she carried, the way her father had taught her without teaching, and its flame leaned steadily inward and did not gutter, which meant air was moving, which meant the passage breathed, which meant she was not walking into a sealed pocket that would smother her. So she went on, one hand on the warm wall, until the passage opened out and her small flame could not find the far side of the room. The Outlaws' cavern was a natural chamber, roughly 24 feet by 40, the roof lost in the dark above her candle. And it was not empty. They had cut shelves into the living rock, flat benches at sleeping height. On one lay 3 wool blankets wrapped tight in oilcloth, and when she peeled the oilcloth back, the wool inside was dry and whole. A canvas tarpaulin, stiff but sound. A row of rusted hand tools, picks, and a shovel, and a drill, and a hammer, the wooden handles gone soft, but the iron still iron. 2 tins of salt, sealed. A crate of beans gone mostly to rotten mouse. A crock of coffee ruined by the wet. And, in a niche behind a loose stone that she found only because her father had taught her which stones sit wrong, a small cloth sack of coins that she counted twice by candlelight. $31.40 in silver, and 1 worn gold piece. She sat down on the cut shelf in the warm dark, with the coins in her lap, and did not at first feel rich. She felt the size of the thing she did not understand, because the coins and the blankets and the salt were help, real help, but they did not answer the question the frost had asked her at the bottom of the cliff. They did not explain the heat. She found the answer in the lowest part of the chamber, where the floor dropped away into a gallery she nearly stepped into in the dark. Water came out of the rock there. It came from a fracture in the far wall and ran across the stone and vanished under a fall of rubble, and when she knelt and put her hand in it, she pulled it back with a cry. It was hot, not warm. Hot enough to redden her skin. It smelled of iron and eggs and something mineral she had no name for, and where the cold air of the passage met the rising heat of the water, thin steam curled and hung. A hot spring, coming up out of a fault in the earth, the way her father had always said the deep water came up, heated somewhere down in the dark, and finding its way back to the light along a broken seam. It ran into the lowest gallery, gave its heat to the rock and the air, and disappeared. And the outlaws, whoever they had been, had not simply hidden beside the warmth. She could see now what they had done. The cut shelves set high where the warm air pooled, the rotted door meant to hold that warmth in, a channel started and abandoned in the floor. They had tried to make the heat go where they wanted it. They had not finished or not managed it, and the wet had beaten them in the end. But they had understood the thing that Orson Kittredge, with his 6 cords of dry wood, had not. You did not have to make heat out here, where every stick of wood cost a day's wage. Out here, the ground was already making it. Birgit crouched in the steam with her ruined red hand, and did the sum that would change the rest of her life. A cabin bled its heat to the sky through every wall and roof, and it needed 6 cords of wood to hold 60 degrees. This chamber had no sky to bleed to. It had 200 feet of rock over it and a spring under it, and if she could keep the heat in and the bad air moving and the water from drowning her, she would not need 6 cords. She might not need 1. She had bought a grave, the surveyor had said. She was beginning to think she had bought the only warm ground for 14 miles. She was wrong about one thing, and Nell Brackett told her so 3 days later, standing in the chamber with a lamp held high, and her mouth pressed thin. Nell had come because Birgit had asked her to, had walked the 14 miles and made the climb with a boarding house cook's contempt for heights, and had stood in the warm dark and put her hand on the sweating wall and then on the wool of a blanket she'd hung near the spring the night before. The blanket was damp, not wet from the spring, damp all through, the way washing goes on a day it will not dry. "Feel that," Nell said. She was 29 and had buried a husband and 2 children and did not waste words. "Warm, yes, and wet. Birgit, warm and wet will kill you slower than the cold, but it will kill you just as dead. Look." She pointed her lamp at the wooden chest by the shelf, and along its seams a gray bloom of mold had come up overnight. "Bedding rots, food spoils, lungs fill. You put people in a warm, wet hole all winter, and by February half of them are coughing blood. I have seen a mining camp do it in one bad season. The heat is not your problem. The water is your problem, and you cannot see it because you want the heat too much." Birgit could not answer her because Nell was right, and she knew it in the same instant she heard it. The candle she had set on the sleeping shelf the night before had burned down shorter and yellower than a candle should, and she had told herself she imagined it. She had not imagined it. Something about the air on that shelf was wrong, and something about the water was wrong, and the very heat that had felt like salvation was also exactly the thing that could rot her alive. "Then I fixed the water," Birgit said, "and the air." "With what?" said Nell. "You have got 80 cents and a dead outlaw's pocket change." "I have got $32.20, Birgit said, "and a place no one can nail shut." Nell looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight. Then she shook her head, not in refusal, but in the way a person shakes their head at someone about to do a hard thing they cannot be talked out of. "You spend that on rope and nails," she said, "and it is gone. If this does not work, there is no Fair East. There is no boarding house. There is nothing between you and the street but a wet cave. You understand that." "I understand it," Birgit said. She understood it better than Nell knew. Every coin she spent on this was a coin she could not spend on running away. She was about to take the only money that could carry her somewhere safe and bury it in a hole in the rock on a bet that she could outthink a hot spring. If she was wrong, she would not merely be poor. She would be poor in a place called Bandit's Throat, with the winter coming down. She spent the money. They were calling it Bandit's Throat within the week, and Birgit knew where the name had come from, because it had come from Milo Danner. He told his livery customers that the widow Stensland had gone to live among hanged road agents, up in the Gorge where the vigilantes had strung men in the old days, and the story grew the way stories grow. The Gorge became a place where ghosts kept accounts. Children began daring one another to walk halfway up the stream bed after dark and run back screaming. A washerwoman who had shared soap and drying line with Birgit for 2 years suddenly had no soap to spare. A merchant who had always taken Birgit's promise of laundry against a bill now wanted cash on the counter, and when she had no cash, he had no goods. The town was closing around her the way the sleet had closed around her on the trunk, quietly, from every side at once. And then the men came to look. Orson Kittredge came first, which surprised her. He made the climb slowly, testing every hold with the point of his cane before he trusted it, and he walked the chamber with the lamp and said nothing for a long time. He put his hand on the wall where the water stain came down above the portal. He tapped a loose slab of the roof with his cane and listened to the sound it made, and his face when he heard it was the face of a man who did not like what he heard. "There is your first killer," he said, pointing the cane at the water stain. "Seasonal drainage. When the snow melts in the spring, water comes down that seam under pressure, and it will find every crack in this roof and open them. He moved the cane to the loose slab. There is your second. That is a ton of rock waiting for a reason to come down, and warm, wet rock finds reasons. He turned to her. A warm wall is no roof support, girl. Heat does not hold stone up. Timber holds stone up, and you have got no timber and no notion how to set it if you had. Then show me where it will break, Birgit said. He looked at her, and for just a moment something shifted behind the old man's eyes, some flicker of a thing that was not quite respect but was in the same family. Then it was gone. I will not, he said. I will not put my name near this. If you get yourself killed up here, and you likely will, it will not be because Orson Kittredge told you it was safe. He went to the portal. But you asked me a true question, so I will answer it true. That slab and that seam are what will kill you. The heat is real. I did not know about the heat. He paused. It does not change my sum. It only makes the grave warm. He climbed down. Birgit took a lump of chalk from her apron and began to mark the fractures in the roof, the way she had watched her father mark a quarry face before a shot, a line along every crack so she could tell day by day whether it was moving. Danner came the next day, and Danner did not come to warn her. He came up the stream bed on foot because his wagon could not make the track, and he stood at the bottom of the cliff and called up to her where she worked on the ledge, and his soft voice carried in the cold gorge like a knife drawn slow. Mrs. Stensland, he called, you find anything up there? Old paper, maybe? Anything folded up in the rocks? She stopped working. Old paper. He had never once in the recorder's office mentioned old paper. He had called the place a hole nobody wanted, and now he stood at the bottom of a cliff he could not climb, asking whether she had found something folded up in the rocks, and she understood at last the thing she had been too cold to hear in that warm office. Milo Danner had not sold her a worthless grave to be shed of the assessments. He had sold her a place he had already searched and failed to search well enough, a place he believed held something worth having, and he had sold it cheap to a widow he expected to freeze out or starve out or scare out by spring, so that he could buy it back for $10 and dig in comfort. I found rocks, Birgit called down, and frost. You sold me both. I will give you $10 for it back, Danner said. Right now, cash in your hand. You take that and the Fair East, and you sleep warm tonight in a real bed, not up there with the dead men. $10, Mrs. Stensland. That is charity, and we both know it. $10. Enough for the fare and a month of beds. Enough to walk away from Bandit's throat and never think of it again. And she knew, hearing him offer it, exactly what it was worth, because a man does not offer $10 for a hole in the rocks he called worthless, unless the hole is worth a great deal more than $10. No, Birgit said. You are a foolish girl. Maybe, she said, but it is my foolishness now. You signed it over. All appurtenances, the deed says. I read it before I signed. Did you? The soft voice went hard for just one word. You will freeze, Danner said. Then he gathered himself, and the softness came back over him like a coat. When you do, I will be sorry to hear it, and I will be right here. He walked back down the stream bed. That night, Birgit found the first of his broken wagons parked across the easiest approach to the gorge, an old wreck with a shattered axle dragged into place so that she would have to carry every board and every tool the long way, along the frozen stream bed, on her own back. If you have ever kept building something after a person with more money and more power stood in your way and told you to quit, you already know what she felt standing there in the dark. Tell us in the comments, who was it that doubted you, and did they ever find out they were wrong? She began to build alone, because there was no one to build with. She spent $11 of the outlaw silver in one hard afternoon in town, and it felt like cutting her own hand off. 60 feet of rope, a keg of nails, a can of lamp oil, and a used pick with a sound handle to replace the rotted outlaw one. Every coin she laid on the counter was a coin that could not carry her east. She carried the whole load back the 14 miles in 2 trips because she could not lift it in one, and the second trip she made in the dark, and the last mile along the frozen stream bed. Her boots broke through the ice at every third step so that she reached the cliff soaked to the knee with the water freezing on her the moment she stopped moving. She learned the work by failing at it. She cleared the rubble from the lower drain first because Kittredge and Nell had both told her, in their different ways, that the water was the killer, and a killer was the thing to deal with first. She hauled the fallen stone away from where the spring vanished, bucket by bucket, up a rope she rigged over a beam, and where the water had backed and pooled it began, slowly, to run again. That much she could do. That much was only labor, and she had never in her life been afraid of labor. The timber beat her. She understood the idea of it. She had watched props go up in the alder mines when she carried her husband his dinner. 2 posts and a cap across them, wedged tight to the roof, so that the weight of the mountain came down through the timber instead of down through your skull. She cut 2 posts from a fallen pine she found up the gorge, dragged them to the chamber and stood them under the loose slab Kittredge had tapped, and cut the cap to fit across them. But she cut 1 post too short. She saw it when she stood the set up, a finger's width of gap between the cap and the roof, and a set with a gap in it holds nothing at all. She packed the gap with loose stones to close it, because she did not have another straight post cut, and the light was going, and her wrist was a hot wire of pain from the wrist to the elbow, and she told herself the stones would do. She knew they would not do. She had watched her father throw a man off a quarry face once for wedging a shot with the wrong stone. A shortcut in stone, he had said, is a grave you dig for the next man. She stood in the warm dark under a ton of rock held up by a lie she had told herself, and her shoulders were raw where the hauling strap had worn through her dress to the skin, and her damaged wrist had gone from pain to a worse thing, a numbness that crept into the fingers, and she was more tired than she had ever been in her life. And she thought, I cannot do this alone, and there is no one. The weather told her how little time was left. That night the sleet turned to snow, the first snow that meant to stay, and in the morning the gorge floor wore white it would not lose again until spring. 6 weeks, Kittredge had said. She had spent nearly 3 of them, and she had cleared 1 drain and set 1 bad prop and marked a roof full of cracks she did not know how to stop from moving. She was standing on the ledge at dawn, chalk in her numb hand, marking the fractures 1 more time so she could measure whether the night's cold had opened them, when she felt the skin on her neck prickle the way it does when a person is watched. She looked down. A man stood at the bottom of the cliff. Not Danner. This man was older and thinner, and stood the way old miners stand, a little bent, favoring his chest. He had a canvas coat gone gray with rock dust, and a length of tallow candle behind one ear, and a long-handled hammer in his fist, the kind with a small square head that Birgit had seen exactly once before in her father's hands. A sounding hammer. The tool a man uses to strike a rock wall and listen to what the sound tells him about the death waiting inside it. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the chalk lines she had drawn up and down the cliff face, the careful marks along every crack, and his head was tilted the way a man tilts his head when a thing he expected to be foolish has turned out not to be. "Girl," the old man called up in a voice torn ragged at the edges by years of breathing rock dust. "Who taught you to mark a face before you trust it? Birgit looked down at the stranger with the sounding hammer, 40 feet below her in the snow, and did not yet know his name, and did not yet know that he was the only man in the territory who could teach her to keep the mountain over her head from coming down, and did not yet know that he was already dying, one wet breath at a time, of the same rock dust that had ground the edges off his voice. She only knew that for the first time since the wash house door, someone had looked at her work and not laughed. "My father," she called down. "He broke stone. Who taught you to ask?" The old man almost smiled. He set one boot on the lowest of the hidden holds and winced and began to climb. The old man came up the hidden holds slower than Birgit had, stopping twice to cough into his fist, and each time the cough went on longer than a cough should. When he reached the ledge, he stood a moment with one hand flat against the cold rock, getting his breath, and Birgit saw that getting his breath was work for him, real work, the way the ringing had once been work for her. "Ansel Bream," he said when he could. "I set timber in the alder mines 22 years. Ventilation man, the last 8 of them, which is the man they send in when the air goes bad and the others will not." He looked past her, into the black mouth of the portal, and his eyes changed. "I heard in town there was a fool girl living in Bandit's throat with the road agents. I did not come up here for that. I came up because a freighter told me the fool girl was marking her cracks with chalk before she trusted the roof, and no fool does that." He turned the ragged eyes on her. "Who dies up here if you get it wrong?" "Only me," Birgit said. "For now." "For now." He nodded slowly. "That will change. A warm hole in a hard winter does not stay a secret, and it does not stay one person's." He coughed again, turned his head to do it. "I will not lie to a woman about to trust her life to stone. I've got maybe 2 years of breath left in me, and every one of them is worth more to me than money, so I do not sell them cheap. But my legs are done, and my lungs are done, and there is nobody left who wants what is in my head. You want it. I can see you want it." He nodded at the chalk marks. "Here is my price. You wash and mend my working clothes through the winter, so I am not a filthy old man, and you feed me when I am up here. In return, I teach you enough that this mountain does not come down on your neck. That is not charity. I am too poor for charity. That is a trade, and I get the better half of it because I get to leave something behind." Birgit looked at the old man swaying a little on the ledge, and understood that he had just offered her the only thing anyone in the county had offered her that was not a trap. "Come inside where it is warm," she said, "before you cough yourself off the cliff. We have a trade." He taught her the air first because the air, he said, killed more men than the rock ever did, and killed them quieter. He took a twist of the canvas tarpaulin, lit the end of it so it smoked without flame, and held it low, at his boot, in the mouth of the passage. The smoke crept inward along the floor, into the chamber, steady as poured water. He raised it to his waist. The smoke drifted inward still, slower. He raised it above his head, near the roof, and the smoke stopped. It hung there. It gathered under the stone, and did not move at all. "There," Ansel said, and the ragged voice was almost gentle. "You see it? The warm air rises, and it goes up under that roof, and it has got nowhere to go from there, so it sits. It sits, and it goes stale, and it fills with the poison of your own breath and your candle and your lungs, and one cold morning it lies down over you while you sleep, and you do not wake up. This chamber breathes in." He pointed at the passage. "It does not breathe out. You have got a mouth and no nose. We have got to give it a nose." They found the nose that afternoon, a narrow raise the Outlaws had started, a rough vertical shaft climbing from the high corner of the chamber toward the surface, choked shut with fallen rock and the bones and dry filth of animals that had died in it over the years. It was too narrow for Ansel and too high for his lungs. Birgit went up it on a rope, into the reeking dark, and cleared it a bucketful at a time while the old man stood below with a lamp and watched the loose stone above her and called warnings up in his torn voice. It took 2 days. Her hands bled. On the evening of the second day, Ansel held the smoking canvas up near the roof one more time, and this time the smoke curled, hesitated, and lifted, drawn up the cleared rays toward the surface and the cold sky above. "One airway open?" Ansel said. He was grinning, which took years off him. "That is the intake and the exhaust in one shaft, which is not good enough, but it is not dead air anymore. We will do better." Then he coughed and the grin folded up and he sat down hard on the cut shelf. "We will do better," he said again to himself. He taught her timber next, and timber was where she learned that he would not let her lie to herself the way she had lied about the short post. A proper set was 3 pieces, he said. 2 posts standing, 1 cap laid across their tops, and then hardwood wedges driven between the cap and the roof until the whole set groaned and took the weight of the mountain onto itself. He made her cut the posts. She cut the first cap too generous and had to trim it twice. The second time she got it. But on the third set, tired, her wrist gone to that creeping numbness again, she cut a post a finger short, exactly the mistake she had made alone, and she did exactly what she had done alone. She reached for loose stones to pack the gap. Ansel's boot came down and swept the stones away before her hand closed on them. He did it fast for an old man. "No," he said. Just the one word, hard as a dropped hammer. Then, quieter, "Never. A set with a stone in it is a set that fails, and it fails all at once, and it fails the day you have stopped thinking about it. You cut it short, you cut a new one. There is no third way that does not end with you under the roof." He looked at her, and the anger went out of him. "I threw a man off a face for that once." "So did my father," Birgit said. "Then your father was a man worth having," Ansel said, "and you will cut a new post." She cut a new post. They set 9 of them through the weakest span of the chamber over 11 hard days, and by the end her shoulders had blistered raw under the hauling strap and burst and begun to callous, and the numbness in her left hand had spread so that she could no longer feel the head of a nail she held, and she did not tell Ansel that because there was no time for it to matter. Then she nearly killed them both trying to be clever about the water. The spring made her greedy. She stood in its rising steam and thought, if a little warm water heats the room, a lake of it will heat it better. She proposed damming the spring where it entered the lower gallery, backing it up into a great steaming pool that would pour its heat into the chamber all winter. She was proud of the idea. Ansel listened to all of it, and then he took his sounding hammer and struck the floor of the chamber in 4 places, slow, listening to each. And at the 4th place the sound came back hollow. "There," he said. "Hear that? There is a void under this floor, an old fracture, dry now. You dam that spring and back the water up, and the water does not sit still and grateful in your pool. Water never sits. It hunts. It finds that fracture. It goes down into it. It works it wider every day and every night all winter, and one morning your floor and everyone sleeping on it drops into the dark. Warm water is not your servant. It is a tenant that pays no rent and burns the house down." He drove the hammer point into the floor. "You do not dam it, you guide it. You take exactly the heat it will give you as it passes, and you show it the door, and you make sure the door is always open." So instead of a dam, they cut a channel, a shallow trough lined with flat stone, 8 inches wide, that carried the spring water in a slow curve across the low gallery, so it gave its warmth to the rock and the air, and then out through the reopened lower drain to wherever it had always gone. 45 feet of it in the end. They cut 26 feet before the first hard setback, and Ansel made her lay the stone so that certain ones lifted out clean without mortar. The silt will clog it, he said. Minerals in that water. It will pack up solid inside a month if you mortar it shut. You leave yourself cleaning stones you can pull and clear, or you will be chipping rock out of a channel in the dark with people freezing behind you. He was right about the silt. Inside 3 weeks, a gray mineral crust had half closed the finished section, and because Birgit could lift the cleaning stones and scrape them, it cost her an evening instead of a disaster. She had begun to notice that Ansel Bream was right about nearly everything, and that he taught her the way a man empties his pockets before a long journey, wanting nothing left over. The setbacks came in a run, the way they do. A thaw loosened the roof, and a slab the length of a wagon let go in the night, and came down across 2 of their finished sets, splintering the caps, filling the span with rubble. Birgit had been sleeping 10 feet from it. She woke to the crack of it and the roar, and lay in the dark, not knowing if she was alive until the dust settled on her face. They lost a week clearing it and setting new timber, and Ansel would not let her hurry the new sets, not by an hour, though every hour now had snow in it. Nell opened the last of the Outlaw stores and found what she had promised they would find. The beans were mouse and rot. The salt tins were good, but salt does not feed a person. Between the spoiled crate and what little Birgit had bought, there were fewer than 10 days of honest food in the whole gorge, and winter was not 10 days. It was 5 months. And Danner came back, not up the cliff, but through the recorder's office with a paper. He had filed a complaint claiming the spring water belonged by right to a rancher downstream, and that Birgit was diverting a watercourse she had no right to touch. Kittredge, of all men, brought her the news, climbing up to tell her himself. "It is a nuisance suit," the old surveyor said, standing in the finished chamber and looking at the timber sets with an expression he was working hard to keep flat. "It has no legs. That water sinks into the ground 100 yards on and never reaches his ranch. But a nuisance suit does not have to win. It only has to take months, and Danner knows it will take months, and he knows what you do not have months of." He looked at the channel, the smoke lifting up the rays, the 9 sets standing square. His jaw worked. "A coffin with hinges, he is calling this. Down at the livery, a coffin with hinges." "And what do you call it?" Birgit said. Kittredge did not answer that. He turned to go. But 3 days later, there were 3 sound-sawn timbers leaning against the wall of the recorder's office with no name on them and the fee already paid. And when Birgit asked Petrie who had left them, he said only that he had been told not to say, and the not saying told her enough. Nell came too, and Nell did not pretend it was anything but what it was. She came up the cliff with a bundle of discarded flour sacks and 2 dented galvanized tubs and a ledger book under her arm, and she set them down and said, "I am not doing this because I think you will live. I am doing it because if you are going to freeze, I would rather you froze clean. The sacks are for the walls to soak the drip. The tubs are for the cold water, covered, so nobody drinks the mineral by mistake and cooks their guts. And this," she held up the ledger, "is mine. I keep the food. I keep the water. I keep the count of who is in this hole and how much they eat, and you do not touch it. Those are my terms." "Those are good terms," Birgit said. "They are the only terms," said Nell, "on which a warm, wet hole full of frightened people does not turn into a grave by February. You keep the rock up and the air moving. I will keep the people from poisoning each other. That is the trade." It was the second trade Birgit had been offered that was not a trap, and she took it. By the time the chamber was finished, the snow lay 2 feet on the level and deeper in the drifts, and the calendar had run out. They tested it on a night that stood at 10 degrees outside, the coldest yet. Ansel would not let anyone sleep in it until it had been watched through a full test, so the two of them and Nell sat the night out with candles and Berget's father's folding rule and a borrowed dairy thermometer. And Berget wrote the numbers in Nell's ledger every hour, because numbers were the one thing she trusted more than hope. 10 degrees outside, 37 in the portal passage, 72 in the low spring gallery where the channel ran, 67 on the dry sleeping shelf they had raised 3 feet above the wet floor. A basin of water set on the shelf did not freeze. A wet blanket hung by the channel dried by morning. They had lit only a small fire in the outer vestibule for cooking, and it had burned a few sticks, not a cord, not half a cord, a few sticks, and the shelf had held 67 degrees on a 10-degree night. It was working. It was working exactly as she had told the frost it would, that first day at the bottom of the cliff. And then, near the 4th hour, Nell said, "The roof is crying." And Berget looked up and saw the condensation running off the timber caps in fat, cold drops, and her own head had begun to pound behind the eyes, a dull, tightening ache. And when she looked at the candle on the sleeping shelf, she saw that it had burned down short and yellow, and its flame stood low, low and lazy, not reaching. "Out," Ansel said. He was already on his feet. "Everyone out, now. Do not argue. Do not gather anything. Out." And they went, up the passage into the killing cold, which had never in Berget's life felt so clean, and she stood in the snow-gulping air that hurt and understood that the room she had built to save her had, for one quiet hour, begun to kill her. "You crowded it," Ansel said when they had all stopped shaking. 3 bodies and a fire and a night's breath, and the exhaust could not carry it. 1 shaft doing the work of 2. I told you a mouth and a nose. We built a nose too small. He coughed, spat, wiped his mouth. "Now you have seen it." "Good. Better you see it with 3 than with 30. This is the lesson, girl. The only one that matters up here. Air first, heat second, always. A cold room full of good air is a hard night. A warm room full of bad air is a grave that feels like a bed. You will forget everything else I taught you before you forget that." "Air first," Berget said. "Heat second. Say it in your sleep." They cut a second bypass beside the inner door and widened the exhaust rays and built a small hood of plank and canvas over its upper mouth, angled so the wind would draw across it and pull the stale air out rather than push snow down in. They tested it again, and this time someone checked the candle every hour and wrote its height in the ledger, and this time the flame stood tall and white all night, and no one's head ached, and the roof stopped crying. Kittredge came to see the second test. He stood in the chamber a long time, watching the tall, clean flame, watching Berget read the thermometer and write the number. When he spoke, it was not to admit anything. "You stopped the first test," he said. "When the candle told you the truth you did not want. You did not tell yourself it was nothing. You put your people out in the cold rather than pretend." "Ansel put us out," Berget said. "You wrote the number down that made him," said Kittredge. He was quiet a moment. "I called you reckless in the office. I take that back. Reckless is not what this is." He turned for the passage. "I am still not sure it will hold 30 frightened souls in a real storm. 6 in a test, with the 2 calmest heads in the county watching the flame. That is one thing. But you are not reckless. I was wrong to say it." It was as close to an apology as Orson Kittredge had come in years, and they both knew it, and neither said so. Ansel said the harder thing after Kittredge had gone. "He's right about the 30, the old man said. He was tired that night, grayer than usual, his breath shallow. "This room is honest with 6. You put 20 in here, 20 wet, frightened people with their breath and their sweat and their lamps and their fear, and they will foul this air faster than any spring can warm it, and faster than any rays can clear it. Fear breathes hard, girl. Panic breathes hardest of all. If it ever comes to that," he stopped to cough. "If it ever comes to a night when this gorge is the last warm place and they all come running, you will not be fighting the cold. You will be fighting the air, and you will be fighting it with a room built for 6. He looked at her. "Pray it does not come, but do not be surprised when it does." The Chinook came in the 3rd week of a hard January, and the town thought its prayers were answered. A warm wind rolled down off the mountains overnight, and the 2 feet of snow began to run. Water sheeted the streets of Virginia City. Icicles fell from the eaves like dropped knives. Men stood in their shirt sleeves and laughed and said the worst was over, and they let their wood piles alone, because why burn wood in a thaw? And the price of a cord, which had climbed to $15, eased back, and the whole town breathed out. Ansel Bream stood at the mouth of the gorge in the warm wind and did not breathe out. He looked at the running snow the way a man looks at a wound that has stopped hurting for the wrong reason. "This is the worst thing that could happen," he said quietly. "This melt. Mark me. All that snow turns to water, and then the cold comes back, and it always comes back, and it freezes every field and road and roof under a shell of solid ice. The cattle cannot break it to reach the grass. The freight cannot move on it. And a town that let its wood pile alone because it thought winter was over wakes up one morning behind a wall of ice with the temperature falling and no time left to cut more." He turned and started up the stream bed toward the cliff, slow, coughing. "Fill the barrels," he called back. "Boil the water. Check the flame. It is coming now. The false spring always comes right before." The cold came back on the 2nd night, and it came back the way Ansel said it would. The temperature fell so far and so fast that the running meltwater froze where it stood. By morning, the whole country wore a shell of ice an inch thick, over the snow, over the roads, over the grass the cattle needed, over everything hard and bright and pitiless. And then, into that frozen world, the blizzard came. It came out of the north with a wind that drove the snow flat and horizontal, that found every seam and every roof and every gap under every door, and pushed the cold inside like a hand. The freight roads vanished in an hour. Birgit stood at the mouth of the gorge in the last gray light and looked toward town and saw the chimney smoke, thin already, thinner than it should be, the smoke of families burning fence rails and green wood and the last of what they had, and she understood that Ansel had read it true, that the town had been robbed of its fear by 3 warm days and was now paying for it. Nell came first. She came up the frozen stream bed at dusk with 2 children of a boarder wrapped in a single quilt, her own face white with cold, and she did not ask. She had known where she would come. Behind her, an hour later, came a teamster and his wife who had tried to run their team for the pass and been turned back, the man's face already showing the gray-white patches of frostbite along one cheek. Birgit met them at the portal, and she did not let them rush in. "Wet clothes come off in the vestibule," she said, and made them do it, though they cursed her for it in the cold. "1 lamp only. No one blocks the low pipe by the door. Ever. Not for warmth, not for anything. The children go on the warm shelf, and every half hour someone looks at the candle and tells me its height." Ansel had taught her the rules, and she laid them down like timber, one at a time, square and load-bearing, because she knew, standing there, that the rules were the only thing between a refuge and a grave that felt like a bed. Then she let them in, and the warmth took them, and the teamster's wife began to cry with the simple animal relief of it, and Birgit went back to the mouth of the gorge to watch for the others she now knew were coming. They came all night. 6 became 12. A widower and his 3 children, 2 miners who had been caught on the road, an old woman from the edge of town whose stove wood had run out at midnight, and who had walked 2 miles through the blizzard on the memory of the direction, half dead when they pulled her up the cliff on the rope. 12 became 19. Birgit and Nell worked the rope and the passage and the ledger, and Nell counted every soul in and portioned the food and the water by the ledger with a hand that did not shake. And the chamber that Ansel had said was honest with 6 held 12, and then held 19, and the condensation on the timber caps thickened and began to run, and the flame of the checking candle, hour by hour, stood a little lower than the hour before. By full dark on the second night, there were 23 people in the room built for 6. The inner shelf held 66 degrees. It should have felt like salvation. But Birgit, moving among the packed bodies with the thermometer, saw the candle by the children gutter and shorten, and felt the first thread of the old ache behind her own eyes, and knew that Ansel's warning had walked up the cliff and into the room. She was not fighting the cold anymore. The cold was beaten. She was fighting the air, in a room built for 6, with 23 sets of frightened lungs pulling it down. And that was when the teamster's wife said the name that made it worse. Ezra. Where was Ezra Vale? Ezra Vale worked for Milo Danner. And Milo Danner, it turned out, had refused to come. He had told his hands the livery was stout enough to ride out any blizzard, and he had shut himself and his horses inside it, and he had sent Ezra out into the worst of it to secure a lean-to roof that was tearing loose, and Ezra had gone out and not come back. His wife had made it to the gorge alone in the dark, screaming his name against the wind, and now she stood in the warm room clutching Birgit's sleeve and begging, and the man who had blocked Birgit's road with broken wagons and called her home a coffin with hinges was warm and dry a mile away with his horses, and his hired man was somewhere out in the killing dark. Birgit looked at Ansel. Ansel could not go. His lungs would not carry him 10 feet into that wind, and they both knew it. She looked at Kittredge, who had come up the cliff at midnight without a word, and taken a place at the airway watch as though he had always belonged there. The old surveyor was already reaching for the rope. "Air first," Ansel said, gripping her arm as she pulled on the teamster's dry coat. "You hear me? You put people out in that gorge on a rope. You keep them tied to the rock and tied to each other. And you do not for any soul living or dead, block that low pipe when you come back in. You bring the cold in with you. You leave the pipe open. Air first." "Air first," Birgit said, and went out into the storm to find the man belonging to the person who had done her the most harm. They found Ezra Vale by the sound of him, a thin cry under the wind, half a mile down the gorge where an overturned feed sled had pinned him against the rock, and the snow had already begun to bury the both of them. Birgit and Kittredge and the teamster crawled to him along the cliff wall on a rope anchored to the portal, hand over hand, the wind trying to peel them off the rock and throw them, the cold so complete it had stopped being cold and become a kind of burning. They levered the sled off him with a timber, and as they lifted, Ansel, who had followed them out despite everything, who could not stay behind while a man he had taught went into the dark, Ansel lost his footing on the ice and went down hard against the sled, and something in his chest gave with a sound Birgit felt more than heard, and the old man folded around his own ribs and could not rise. Birgit took command of the rope then, because there was no one else. She lashed Ansel and Ezra both into the line, and she brought them back along the cliff a foot at a time, hauling, calling the count, keeping every body tied to the rock, and it took the better part of an hour to cross the half-mile, and when they came up over the lip into the portal, at last Ezra Vale was alive, barely, his hands and feet frozen white and hard, and Ansel was gray and breathing in short, bitten gasps around his broken ribs, and Birgit's own hands would not open from the shape of the rope. She did not block the low pipe. She brought the cold in with her, and she left the pipe open, and Ansel, flat on the shelf with his ribs stove in, watched her do it and closed his eyes. Then the exhaust failed. The same wind that had nearly killed them on the cliff had packed snow and torn debris against the little hood over the upper raise and sealed it, and the room's one nose closed. The condensation on the timbers went from running to raining. The old woman from the edge of town began to breathe in a way Nell did not like, slow and far apart. Two of the children grew heavy and would not fully wake, and Nell, kneeling by the sleeping shelf with the checking candle in her hand, looked up at Birgit with an expression Birgit had never seen on her before and said, "Low," so the others would not hear. "The candle is almost out. Birgit, the candle by the children is almost out." 23 people in a room built for 6, the one airway sealed by the storm, the flame going down in the dark. If you need to know whether that room let them breathe, subscribe and stay with us. What she does next is the whole reason this story is still told. The exhaust was 50 feet up a cliff in a blizzard, and Ansel could not climb, and every instinct in the room screamed the wrong answer. Kittredge said it out loud because someone had to. "Open the outer door," he said. "Bleed the bad air out the passage. If you open the top in this wind, you lose all our heat and these children freeze." And it was reasonable. It was exactly the reasonable, practical, killing answer. And Birgit felt the whole room lean toward it, toward the warmth, toward keeping the heat. She heard Ansel's voice, though the old man was too far gone to speak it now. Air first, heat second, always. A warm room full of bad air is a grave that feels like a bed. Opening the passage door would not clear the poison pooling under the roof. It would only cool the floor while the bad air sat above them, and they would sleep, and some of them would not wake, and the room would stay warm the whole time. "No," Birgit said, "the heat is not what is killing them. The air is killing them. I am opening the top." She tied herself to the inner anchor with the rope still stiff in the shape of her hands, and she went up the cleared raise from the inside into the black throat of the shaft, climbing the rough rock in the dark, with the wind howling louder the higher she went, and at the top she came out into the full blizzard on the upper ledge 58 feet above the gorge floor, and she found the hood sealed under a foot of wind-packed ice, solid, the room's one breath frozen shut. She had a hand pick through her belt. She braced her frozen feet against the rock and she swung it, and the warm vapor still trying to rise past the ice froze across her sleeves and her face as she worked, coating her in a shell of her own breath. And she swung the pick again and again into the ice with arms that had already hauled 2 men half a mile until the ice cracked and split and fell away, and the room below her exhaled. She felt it. She felt the warm, stale breath of 23 people rush up past her into the storm, and cold, clean air pour down the shaft to take its place. And below her in the dark, she heard Nell's voice call up, thin and cracking, "It is standing up, Birgit! The flame is standing up!" The candles recovered. The old woman's breath deepened. The heavy children woke and cried, which was the most beautiful sound Birgit had ever heard, because a child that cries is a child that breathes. The chamber temperature slid from 66 down to 61 and stopped there, 61 degrees, and held. And 61 degrees was a hard night, and a hard night was a night everyone lived through. She was not done. The gorge was not done with her. While the exhaust had been sealed, the same ice that closed the top had closed the bottom. The outlet where the warm channel drained had frozen over on the outside, and with nowhere to go, the spring water began to back up, out of its channel, across the low gallery, rising toward the sleeping shelf and the packed bodies on it. Someone screamed that the floor was flooding. Panic moved through the room like the cold had, and panic breathes hardest of all. Every instinct said, damn it, block the spring, stop the water at its source. Birgit knew better now. Ansel had taught her the last thing he would ever teach her before his ribs broke. You do not damn it, you show it the door. She waded into the rising warm water and pulled the cleaning stones from the channel to open its throat, and then, with the pick, she cut a rough emergency notch through the lip of the lower gallery. Down into the old dry drain, and the backed-up water found the new door she had cut it and poured away from the shelf, down into the dark, scalding and mineral and gone, and the flood on the floor stopped rising and began to fall. They lost one. He came too late. An old freighter brought up the cliff near dawn by two of the miners who had gone out for him had been too long in the ice before they found him, and he died in the outer passage within sight of the warm shelf, quietly, without waking. There was nothing in the room that could have saved him. He had spent his heat before he ever reached the gorge. Birgit knelt by him in the cold passage and closed his eyes with fingers that still would not fully open. The refuge was never meant to be a miracle. It was stone and water and moving air, and stone and water and moving air do not raise the dead. They only give the living a place to stand. The old freighter had reached that place a quarter of an hour too late, and a quarter of an hour, in that winter, was the whole distance between a name on a rescue roll and a name on a stone. Then she stood up, and she went back to the sleeping shelf, and she checked the flame. They held there for 3 days while the blizzard spent itself against the walls of Black Glass Gorge. The chamber never fell below 59 degrees and never rose above 64. Nell portioned the little food into littler portions and wrote everyone in the ledger, and no one went without, and no one had much. A handful of sticks in the vestibule fire cooked what there was and boiled the cold seep water so no one sickened. Kittredge and Danner's frostbitten man Ezra, when he could sit up, took turns at the airway watch, calling the flame's height across the room every half hour through the long dark, and the wood they burned in 3 days would not have kept a surface cabin warm for one. Milo Danner came up the cliff on the second day, having finally understood that his stout livery was a colder place to die than a hole in the rocks, and Birgit let him in under Nell's rules like anyone else, and said nothing about the wagons, or the water suit, or the coffin with hinges. She watched him find his hired man Ezra alive on the warmest part of the shelf, the man Danner had sent into the storm, and Birgit had gone into the storm to bring back, and she watched something happen in Milo Danner's soft, dangerous face that she could not name. He did not apologize. He was not a man who could. But near the end of that second day he came to her quietly and set down the last of his livery's lamp oil on the ledger table, and he did not ask a price for it, and that, from Danner, was a kind of confession. On the fourth morning the wind died. Birgit went up the passage past the sleeping shelf, where 22 living souls lay in a warmth she had cut out of the frozen earth with her own broken hands, and she pushed open the outer door, and the storm was gone. The gorge lay under a new and blinding country of snow, reshaped, softened, terrible, and beautiful in the flat morning light. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the quiet did not say better. She stood in the doorway of the place they had called Bandit's Throat, the grave with a deed, and listened, and the first sound she heard in the whole white silent world was the small patient ticking of the spring still running deep in the rock behind her, warming the room where the town had come to live. She had survived. They had survived. And standing in that doorway, Birgit already understood that surviving had been the smaller half of it, that the harder question was not whether she could keep herself alive one winter, but what a person becomes once the whole town knows there is a warm place in the gorge, and a woman who holds the only key to it, and a deed with her name on it that a desperate man had signed away for $5 and would give a great deal to have back. The storm was over. The fight for what she had built was about to begin. The survivors went home over the next 2 days, down the cliff on the new snow, back to houses that had held and houses that had not, and every one of them carried the same story down into the town, that the widow in Bandit's throat had a warm place in the rock, and that 22 of them were alive because of it. The story went ahead of them like smoke. By the time Birgit followed it down to check on Ansel's ribs, the gorge was no longer a grave with a deed. It was the only thing anyone in Virginia City wanted to talk about. She did not let the talk turn her head, because Ansel had taught her that the mountain does not care what the town says. Before she believed one word of her own success, she went back up and inspected everything with the folding rule and a cold eye. She checked all 9 timber sets. Several of the wedges had shifted under the winter's working, backed out a half inch, a full inch the way wedges do. She drove them home again and marked their new positions in chalk. But not one cap had cracked, not one post had failed. The channel had silted where she knew it would silt, and cleared when she pulled the stones. The spring, which had backed up and flooded and been cut a new door in the worst hour of the storm, still ran its steady 7 gallons a minute, warm and patient, as if none of it had happened. The room had done what she built it to do. She wrote that in Nell's ledger, too, because a thing written down is a thing you can defend. The first man to say it out loud who owed her nothing was a freight agent named Corliss, passing through from Helena to settle accounts before the roads fully opened. He had heard the story, and he did not believe it, and he said so, and Birgit liked him better for saying so. She took him up the cliff and let him carry his own thermometer, and he stood in the chamber through an afternoon and read the numbers himself and wrote them in his own book, and when he came down he was a changed man about it. He had measured the sleeping shelf at 62 degrees while the thermometer nailed to the recorder's porch in town read 4 above 0. He said he had seen surface cabins that week, tight, well-built cabins that had burned through a cord of wood every 5 days and still frozen their water buckets solid by the door. The refuge across the whole 3 days of the storm had burned a fraction of a single cord in the vestibule fire. He wrote a figure in his book and underlined it twice and said he had never seen the like, and Corliss, the freight agent, had seen a great deal. Birgit did not gloat over the number, but she kept a copy of it. Orson Kittredge did the hardest thing of any of them, which was to be wrong in public. He called the residents together at the recorder's office on the first market day after the roads opened, and he stood in the same room where he had told a shivering widow she had bought a grave, and he made himself say it plain in front of the men who had heard him say the other thing. In October, I told this woman she had paid $5 for a grave with a deed. He did not soften it. I told her a body needs 6 cords of wood to hold a cabin through the winter, and that she had neither the wood, nor the money, nor the sense. I was a man who had surveyed that ground, and I said it with all the weight of that, and men in this room believed me because I am usually right. He paused, and the pause went on long enough to cost him. I was wrong. And I want to tell you exactly how I was wrong, because a man who cannot say how he was wrong has not really admitted it. I counted the heat. That is all I counted. I asked how much heat a shelter needs and where she would get it, and I could not see where, so I called it a grave. What I did not count, what I did not think to count in 50 years of surveying, was how fast a shelter gives its heat back. A cabin throws its heat at the sky through every board all night long. That gorge throws its heat at nothing. 200 feet of rock over it, and a spring under it, and walls that keep in what a cabin would let out. He looked at Birgit. And I will tell you the other thing, because it is true and it matters. It was not only the warm rock that saved those people. Warm rock with bad air would have killed every soul in it by the second night. What saved them was that she moved the air. She built two ways for the air to travel, and she watched a candle flame like it was scripture. And when the air went bad, she put people out in the cold rather than lie to herself. The rock gave her the heat. The discipline kept them alive. I counted neither, and I was wrong, and there it is. No one in the room said anything for a moment. Then a man in the back said quietly, "You are still usually right, Orson." And it broke the thing, and there was even a little laughter, and Kittredge sat down, and it was done. He had been the authority that dismissed her. Now he was the authority that vouched for her, and in a small town those are the same voice pointed two directions, and the second direction is worth more than the first ever cost. Milo Danner tried one last time to make the deed pay him back. He filed a new complaint the same week, and this one had teeth in it, or was meant to. He alleged that Birgit had defrauded him in the sale, that she had known or discovered that the parcel held a valuable hot spring and improvements and had concealed it, and that the sale should therefore be set aside and the property returned to him at the $5 price, plus the value of what she had built. Birgit stood in the recorder's office and listened to it read out, and she felt the old cold settle in her stomach, because a nuisance suit only had to take time, and this one could take her whole refuge. But Danner had made two mistakes, and the recorder, Petrie, who had watched the original sale and said nothing then, was not minded to stay silent now. Petrie noted for the record that Milo Danner had sold his interest in the Warm Shadow Mill site, with all appurtenances, a phrase Danner himself had insisted on, to be shed of any future claim, and that a spring that rises on the land is an appurtenance of the land by any reading. Whatever was in that gorge, Danner had signed it away in his own words. And then a second thing came out, because two of the miners who had sheltered in the refuge stood up and testified to what they had heard over the years at the livery, that Danner had gone out to Black Glass Gorge more than once with a lantern and a spade, hunting the old road agent's money, and had come back cursing it as a worthless hole, which meant he had searched the very parcel he now claimed he had sold in ignorance. A man cannot spend 3 autumns searching a place for treasure and then swear he did not know it might hold value. The complaint did not merely fail. It made Danner smaller in the eyes of every man in the room. Birgit could have finished him. She held that in her hands and knew it. She could have stood up and told the whole story, the broken wagons across her road, the water suit meant only to waste her time, the coffin with hinges, the hired man he sent into the storm and would not go out for. She could have made Milo Danner a name that men said with contempt for the rest of his life, and the town that week would have believed every word and cheered. She did not. "I do not want his business ruined," she told Petrie, loud enough for Danner to hear. "I want 3 things in writing, and then I want to be done with him." She counted them on her fingers the way she counted coins. "I want my road unblocked and kept unblocked. I want his claim on the gorge withdrawn, signed so no man raises it again after I am gone. And I want the timber standing in his livery yard, the sawn timber, the good pieces for the safety of the gorge, since the gorge is the town's now, whether the town admits it or not." She looked at Danner. "That is less than I could take. Take the trade, Milo. It is the last time I will offer you one." Danner took it. He took it because his hired man, Ezra Vale, was alive on the mercy of the woman he had wronged, and the whole town knew it, and a man in that position does not haggle. He signed the withdrawal. He unblocked the road, and within the month the good timber from his livery yard was going up the cliff on the new rope, which was as close to an apology as Milo Danner would come that year, though it was not yet the end of his long, slow turning. Then the town came to learn, and Birgit had to decide what kind of teacher she would be. They came in ones and twos at first, and then in a steady stream. A rancher who had a warm seep on his North 40 and wanted to know could he make a room like hers. Two brothers from a played-out claim up the valley who had found an old adit and thought they might winter in it. A widow like she had been, younger even, who had nothing and had heard there was a way to be warm without wood. They came wanting the secret, the trick, the magic of the warm gorge. And Birgit understood, looking at their hopeful faces, that the most dangerous thing she could do was give it to them. So she taught them backward. She did not teach them how to build a refuge. She taught them how to know when not to. "The first thing I will teach you," she told the rancher, up in the chamber with a smoking twist of canvas in her hand, "is every reason to walk away and never come back, because most warm holes in the ground will kill you, and the whole skill is knowing which ones." She held the smoke low and high, the way Ansel had taught her. Dead air. If the smoke will not lift, if there is no second way out for it, you do not fix that with a fire and a prayer. You leave. A warm room with one door is a coffin, and it does not matter how warm. She rapped the roof with a sounding hammer and made him listen to the sound. Loose roof. If it rings hollow, there's a slab waiting, and warm, wet rock lets go easier than cold, dry rock, not harder. If you cannot timber it, and timber it right, with no stone in the set, you leave. She pointed at the channel. Water you cannot control. If the water has nowhere to go but where you sleep, you leave. You do not dam it. You never dam it. She looked at him. If you remember nothing else, remember that I am teaching you 4 ways to die, and telling you to respect all 4. The warm part is easy. Any fool can find warm. The staying alive part is the 4 things I just showed you, and if a place fails even one of them, you thank God you found out, and you go home to your cold cabin and your honest wood. The rancher had come for a trick and was leaving with a warning, and Birgit could see him deciding whether to be disappointed or grateful. Most of them, given a night to think, chose grateful. A few did not, and went off to try it their own way, and Birgit could only mark them in the ledger and hope. Nell made her own conversion permanent by making it a law. She wrote out, in the front of the ledger in her square hard hand, the rules that had kept 22 people alive: wet clothing off in the vestibule and racked to dry, 1 lamp per 6 souls, and no more. The low intake never blocked for any reason, the flame checked, and its height written down every half hour any time the room held more than 8. The mineral spring marked in 3 places, not for drinking, the cold seep water boiled before it touched a lip. A set number of bodies, and not one more without Birgit's own word. The woman who had climbed the cliff to tell Birgit she would rot before she froze had become the keeper of the rules that made sure no one did either. She never once said she had been wrong. She did not have to. She had simply moved her whole self to the other side of the argument and taken command of it, which is what conversion looks like in a practical person. By the time the last snow was rotting off the high ground, the town had done a thing towns rarely do for one of their own. It had spent money on her. It funded a proper approach up the cliff, a stair of pinned timber and fixed rope to replace the killing hidden holds, so that an old woman or child could come up in a storm without dying on the way to safety. Birgit oversaw every foot of it, and when a committee man proposed cutting a broad ramp into the cliff, wide enough to run a handcart, she refused him flat. A cut that wide would undercut the very rock the roof depended on, and she would not trade the refuge's bones for a convenience. They put a bell on the upper ledge instead, a real ship's bell freighted in from somewhere, to be rung in a storm so the lost could steer to it, and they set an iron chest of blankets and splints and dry provisions inside the vestibule against the next bad winter. Bandit's throat had a name change. Nobody voted on and everybody used. They started calling it the warm shadow after the deed. Through all of it, Ansel Bream sat mending, and this was the sweetest season of the whole story, and the shortest. His ribs knit slowly, and the fall had done something deeper that neither of them said aloud, some further insult to lungs already failing so that he could no longer make the climb at all, and sat instead by the stove in a rented room, or on good days at Nell's long kitchen table, and taught with his hands and his ragged voice while Birgit did the climbing. She would come down from the gorge and sit across from him, and they would go over everything, the wedge positions, the silt in the channel, the draw of the exhaust in different winds, and she began, in those sessions, to redraw all his diagrams clean because his were smudged and years old and lived mostly in his head. It was over the diagrams that the thing shifted between them for good. He was dictating the measurements for a three-piece set from memory, the span between the posts, and he gave her a figure, and Birgit stopped her pencil and said, "No, that is too wide for this rock. I measured it. It wants 6 inches closer or the cap flexes." And she showed him, on the clean drawing, why. Ansel looked at it a long time. An older man, a proud man, a man who had set timber for 22 years, being corrected on a span by a woman he had taught the winter before. His jaw worked. Then he took the pencil out of her hand, and he changed the figure himself in his own shaking script, and he said, "You are right. I have carried that number wrong for 30 years and never had a rock catch me at it. You caught me at it." And he almost smiled. "That is the trade paying out. You were supposed to end up knowing something I do not." She learned his story slowly across those kitchen table weeks, because he gave it the way he gave everything, in pieces, only when it served the lesson. He had been the ventilation man, the one they sent into the fouled workings, because early in his life he had been in a mine when the air went bad, and had walked out over men who had not boys, some of them, and had spent the rest of his years making sure the air moved so that no one else had to walk out over anyone. That was why he had come up the cliff in the first place. Not for the fool girl, and not for the money. For the chalk marks. Because a person who marks the danger before trusting the ground was, to Ansel Bream, the only kind of person worth spending his last breath on. They had one true clash, and it was about what the warm shadow should become. "Keep it small," Ansel told her, one evening when the town's plans for the place had grown grand. 6 people, you're 6. You, Nell, and hers. A body or 2 more in a bad night. That room is honest with 6, girl, I have told you, and every soul past 6 you promise is a soul you might have to bury. You do not owe this town a hotel in the rock. You owe yourself a warm place to live and no man's blood on your ledger. "I put 23 in it," Birgit said. 22 lived. "And it near killed them, and it near killed you on that ledge, and you got lucky with the wind." "It was not luck. It was the second airway you made me build. It was luck that the second airway held." Ansel coughed hard, and when he had his breath, he was quieter. "I built refuges to save the men in them. You are building one to save a whole town, and a whole town is more than any one room can hold. I'm afraid for you. That is the truth under it. I'm afraid you will die keeping too many people alive." Birgit was quiet for a moment. She did not argue the numbers because on the numbers he was right. She argued the other thing. "When my husband died," she said, "the mining office showed me a closed account and put me on the street, and not one person in this county owed me a roof, and I nearly died of it. I will not build a place that turns people away by account. I will build a place that is honest about its danger and open about its rules and takes every soul it safely can and tells the truth when it cannot take more. That is not a hotel, Ansel. That is the opposite of the office that put me out." She put her hand on his, on the shaking hand that had corrected the span. You taught me to respect the room's limits. I do, but you cannot teach me to lock the door. I have been on the other side of a locked door. Ansel looked at her for a long time. He did not concede. But he never raised it again, and some weeks later he did the thing that meant more than conceding. He took his father's folding rule, the twin of the one her own father had left her, worn to the color of honey, and he set it in her hand and closed her fingers over it and said, "You will measure truer than I did. Use it." He had not given it to her while he was still correcting her plans. He gave it only after she had corrected his. That was the whole of what he thought of her, said without a word of it. The spring thaw brought the test that proved his gift was not sentiment, because it came for her when he could not. The same false spring pattern that had nearly destroyed the town in January ran in reverse in April, a fast, hard melt off the high country, more water than the ground could take, all of it looking for a way down. And it found one. Meltwater drove into the upper fracture above the gorge, the same seam Kittredge had warned her about that first cold day, the one he had called her first killer, and one morning, the wall above the portal, dry all winter, began to weep, and then to run. A sheet of cold water sliding down the rock inside the passage, pooling on the vestibule floor, working at the timber of the door frame. Ansel could not come. He was bedridden now, for good, gray and short of breath in the room above Nell's. And when Birgit sent word, he sent back only a scrawled line in the shaking hand. Sound it first. Do not blast wet rock. Relieve the water slow. Crib before you widen. Keep the men out of the run. It was every principle he had boiled down to 5 commands, and it was all he could give her, and it was enough. Because the men wanted to blast. 2 of the brothers from up the valley had come to help, and they were miners, and a miner's answer to water in the rock is a bigger hole for it to leave by, and they wanted to set a charge of black powder in the weeping wall, and blow a proper drain through it, and be done in a day. It was the fast answer, the strong answer, the answer that felt like doing something. And Birgit, standing in the running water with the door frame softening beside her, and the whole refuge at stake, wanted it too, wanted to reach for the powder and the fuse and the loud, decisive end to it. "No," she said, "you do not blast wet rock. Wet rock has no strength to give, and there is a loose slab in this roof I have been minding all winter. You put a charge in that wall now, and you do not open a drain. You bring the whole roof down on the room we are trying to save." "Then it floods," the elder brother said, "while you sound your walls and dither." "Then it floods slower than a cave-in," said Birgit, "which is a thing a person can live through. Get out of the run, all of you. Out of the line the water would take if it breaks. Now." She did it Ansel's way, alone in the essentials because the essentials could not be delegated. She sounded the wall with the hammer, foot by foot, listening, and found where the water pressed hardest behind the rock and where the rock was sound enough to trust. She did not fight the water head on. She relieved it, drilled a small hole, a finger's width, low and to the side by hand, to bleed the pressure off gradually, so the wall stopped straining even as it kept weeping. Then, and only then, with the pressure eased, she and the brothers cribbed the weakened door frame with the good livery timber, boxing it in stout, before they touched the drainage at all. And last, out on the cliff face where a break would hurt no one, she cut a shallow spillway, a lined channel that took the meltwater sheeting down the outer rock and carried it wide around the portal, past the door, down the cliff, away. Not through the refuge, around it. She was doing this without the man who taught her, following 5 lines of a dying miner's handwriting and her own hard-won judgment, with a room full of lives depending on getting it right. If a story about hard-won knowledge outliving the person who earned it means something to you, share it with someone who ought to hear it. Some things are too important to bury with the one who knew them. It cost her. When the wall finally shed its load, a section of the new exterior stair tore loose and went down the cliff in a slide of timber and cold water. Weeks of the town's work gone in a minute. But the spillway held. The door frame, cribbed, held. The loose slab, untouched by any charge, stayed where it was. And the inner chamber, the warm heart of the whole thing, the room where 22 people had breathed through the worst night of their lives, stayed dry and sound and warm, untouched by the flood that had come to take it. She had solved a problem Ansel had never solved for her. He had never faced that seam, never cut that spillway, never had to bleed pressure off a wet wall with a room of lives behind him. He had given her principles, and she had built an answer out of them that was her own. That was the moment, standing soaked and shaking on the cliff, with the water running safely wide of the door, that she stopped being a woman applying a dead art and became a woman who owned it. When she climbed down and sent word to Ansel that the refuge had held, that she had sounded and relieved and cribbed and spilled it wide, the answer that came back was 3 words in the failing hand. Knew you would. He died in June of 1888 in the room above Nell's boarding house, with the town's whole better opinion of him earned in the 2 years since a fool girl had let him climb her cliff. Birgit was with him. He went quiet, the way the fouled air takes them, slow and far apart, the thing he had spent his life sparing other men from finally coming for him from the inside. Near the end, he was not making sense, talking to boys from a mine 40 years gone, and then for a moment he was clear, and he looked at Birgit and said, "Move the air," and she said, "Air first, heat second, always." And he closed his eyes as if she had gotten the answer right, and after a while he stopped. She did not fall apart, because falling apart was not a thing the work allowed, and the work was the only way she knew to carry him. She did not put a pick or a lamp or a folding rule on his grave, no romance of the trade, none of the false weight that men lay on dead miners. She did a truer thing. She took every one of his diagrams, the clean ones she had drawn, and the smudged old ones in his own hand with his own corrections, span and wedge and the draw of air in a low intake and a high exhaust. And she made fair copies of them all, and she carried them down to the recorder's office and placed them in the public record, where any man building a shelter could read them for free forever, with Ansel Bream's name on every sheet. His knowledge would not die in a room above a boarding house, the way it had nearly died in his failing head. It would live in the record, and in her hands, and in every warm room in the county built the way he had taught. She had buried the man. She had refused to bury the work. He would have called that a fair trade. It was the one he had come up the cliff for. The warm shadow ran without him after that, and it ran because he had made sure it could, and Birgit found herself, at 22 years old, the keeper of the only sure winter refuge for 14 miles, and the teacher every hopeful fool with a warm seep came to see. People no longer waited for her to come to them. They came up the new stair to her, hats in hand, with their questions and their bad ideas and their desperate winners, and she met them at the top with the folding rule in her pocket and 4 ways to die on her lips, and she sent most of them home wiser and a few of them home safe. But the story was not finished with her, and neither was Milo Danner, who had unblocked her road and given up his claim and sent his timber up the cliff, and who still, in his soft, dangerous heart, had not fully surrendered the thing he had believed for 2 years, that the widow in the Gorge had gotten lucky and that a man like him would come out ahead in the end. He was wrong about that too. But it would take another winter and a debt he did not expect to owe to show him how wrong. And there were other things coming up the new stair besides desperate ranchers and doubting miners, things Birgit, who had built her whole life around never again depending on anyone, was not braced for at all. She had learned to survive. She had learned to build and to teach and to hold a line against a flood in a town and a dying man's fear. What she had not yet learned was what to do when the gorge, having given her a warm place to stand alone, began to fill up with people she could not imagine standing without. The offer that could have made Birgit Stensland rich came up the new stair on a fine day in the autumn of 1888, in the person of a man from Helena in a good coat who did not once take off his gloves. His name was Renwick, and he represented money, and everyone had heard by then about the warm gorge 14 miles from Virginia City, where a woman kept the winter out of the rock. He walked the outer passage with the eye of a man pricing a thing, and he felt the warmth, and he saw the steam rising off the spring. And Birgit watched him do the sum she had done 2 years before and reach a very different answer. He did not see a refuge. He saw a resort. A bathing establishment, Renwick said, warming his gloved hands over the channel. Mineral baths. People pay for mineral baths, Mrs. Stensland, pay dearly, and travel far to do it. We would build out the front, private rooms, a proper road. He waved a hand at the cliff. Regrade all this. Pipe the spring where we want it. You would take a fair price for the deed and a share besides, and you would never wash another man's shirt or climb this cliff in a storm again as long as you lived. He smiled, and it was a real smile, and the offer under it was real too. You would be comfortable. You have earned comfortable. It was more money than Birgit had ever seen named in one place. It was the fair East, and a house with afternoon sun, and a life with no rope in it, and no flame to check at 3 a.m. It was, in every way that a tired woman of 22 who had started with $5.80 could measure, the end of the hard road. She asked him one question. In a storm, she said, when the town's wood runs out and the roads close and the families come up this cliff in the dark, the way they came in '87, do they get in? Renwick's smile did not falter, but something behind it adjusted. We would have to control access, he said carefully. A commercial establishment cannot simply during the season, of course. If there were room, arrangements might. No, Birgit said. She said it the way she had said it to Danner at the bottom of the cliff, flat, finished. You want to reroute the spring and put a gate on the only warm ground for 14 miles and open it to whoever can pay in July. And in January, when it is the difference between a family living and a family freezing, you would have them ask an arrangement of a man in Helena. She shook her head. I bought this place with the last money I had on a day when a locked door had just put me on the street. I'm not going to be the locked door, not for any amount. You can put your gloves back to good use somewhere else. Renwick left disappointed, but not, she thought, entirely without respect, which was more than most men managed when they were told no by a laundress. And once he was gone, Birgit sat a long time in the warm dark and understood that she had just turned down the end of the hard road, and that she needed a reason better than stubbornness, because stubbornness does not fund lamp oil. The reason she built was the cooperative, and it was the most practical decision she ever made, though the town insisted on calling it noble. She would not own the warm shadow alone, to be tempted alone, and to die and leave it to whoever grabbed fastest. She organized it instead as a thing held in common by its members, families of the town and the valley, who paid a small share in and took on a share of the keeping. In the safe seasons, the outer passage ran as a wash house and a bathing room, and people paid to use it, modest fees, a coin for a hot wash on a cold spring day, and those coins were not profit. They bought timber and rope and lamp oil, and the 2 months of dry provisions the iron chest was meant to hold. In a declared storm, the fees stopped, and the gate stood open, and the refuge was free to any soul who could reach it, member or stranger, paying or penniless. and no man in Helena or anywhere else could say otherwise, because no one man owned the door. It is not charity, she told the committee, because she had learned from Ansel to be honest about the trade. Charity runs out the year the giver dies or the year the harvest fails. This does not run out because everyone pays a little and everyone owes a little and everyone gets to live. I am not being kind. I am building a thing that will still be standing when I am gone and cannot be kind at all. They named it on the deed as she asked, the Warm Shadow Refuge and Wash House. Nell Brackett kept its accounts and its provisions and its ledger of souls, the same square hard hand that had portioned beans in the dark, now portioning the year, and it was understood by everyone without a word said that Nell and Birgit ran the place between them, the cook and the widow, two women who had each buried a family and found, in a warm hole in a cursed gorge, a thing worth the rest of their lives. The town waited a while for one of them to marry and be sensible, and neither did. And after a while, the town stopped waiting and simply called them the Women of the Warm Shadow, which suited them both fine. The place at its full working was a marvel of small disciplines, and Birgit ran it like the ledger it was. On an ordinary winter's day, the outer passage steamed with wash, and the sound of it, women who had once refused Birgit their soap, now paying for her hot water and glad of it. Deeper in, the inner chamber sat quiet and guarded. The sleeping shelves swept, the drip gutters clear, the mineral spring marked not for drinking in 3 places, the cold seat barrels covered, and the water boiled. Twice a year Birgit ran a drill that the members grumbled about and never skipped. On a chosen night, she would have every person in the place clear both exits in full darkness, no lamp, by feel and by memory, because a person who has found the low intake and the high raise blind in a calm hour will find them in a storm when the lamps are out and the fear is on. Children learned the drill as a game and grew into adults who could have led their own families out of that cave with their eyes shut, and some of them, in the years to come, did exactly that in other caves and other bad winters, and lived. The proof that she had built a thing, and not merely survived a winter, came in 1893, in a storm that old-timers said was near the equal of the one that made her. It began the same way the killing winter had begun, an early snow, a treacherous warm spell, a hard freeze that sealed the country under ice. And Birgit, 27 years old now, and no longer a girl anyone underestimated, felt the whole shape of it coming the way Ansel had taught her to, and did the one thing the first winter had never let her do. She got ready before it arrived. The chest was stocked. The provisions were laid in. The channel was cleared, the wedges checked, both airways sounded, the bell greased on its ledge. And when the blizzard came down at last and the town's chimneys began to thin, the families did not stumble up a hidden cliff on bleeding hands in the dark. They came up a pinned stair with a rope to hold and a bell ringing them home through the white, and they were met at the top by people who knew exactly what to do because they had done it every year as a drill. The woman running the airway watch that night was named Marta, and Birgit had first seen her as a child of 6, one of the 2 little ones Nell had carried up the cliff in a single quilt on the worst night of 1887. Marta had grown up on the drills. She had learned to sound a wall before she learned to cook, and now she was one of the 3 inspectors Birgit trusted with the rock, and on that night in '93, it was Marta, not Birgit, who called the flame's height across the room every half hour, Marta who set the wet coats to rack in the vestibule, Marta who told a frightened newcomer in the exact flat words Birgit had once used on a teamster, that the low pipe by the door was never to be blocked for any reason on earth. Birgit sat on the warm shelf among the sheltering families, and watched a child she had helped pull frozen out of a storm run the machine of survival with her own steady hands, and she gave not one order all night because the room no longer needed her to. It kept itself. That was the difference between surviving a winter and building against all of them. A woman who survives is warm for one season. A woman who teaches is warm long after she is cold in the ground. 19 souls sheltered in the warm shadow through the storm of 1893. The chamber never fell below 60 degrees, and when the wind died on the third morning, 19 people walked back down the good stair, all 19, not one name for a stone, because the second time the town had been ready, and being ready was the whole of what Birgit Stensland had spent her life teaching a country too proud to learn it the easy way. She trained inspectors because she would not be the only pair of hands that could read the rock. 2 young men, and, to the town's quiet scandal, a young woman learned to sound a wall with an iron tool and hear the death in it, to hold a smoking twist of canvas, low and high, and read the draw, to check a wedge and a flame and a channel, to write it all in the ledger so the next inspector knew what the last had found. The ledger grew from Nell's single book into a shelf of them, a written memory of every wedge that moved and every winter that came. And Ansel Bream's folding rule hung on a nail beside that shelf where every inspector could see it, and beside the rule hung the fair copies of his diagrams with Birgit's corrections still on them in her own pencil. The span he had carried wrong for 30 years set right for good. The town changed around the gorge, which was the truest measure of the thing. Men who had laughed at a woman filling a cave now built their surface cabins with a low vent and a high one, because she had taught them that a house that cannot breathe is a house that kills you slow. Families that had let their woodpiles alone in a false thaw and nearly died of it now kept a winter plan and a stock chest and knew the road to the gorge by heart. The phrase, "a grave with a deed," which had followed Birgit for a whole hard winter, simply stopped being said. The way a wrong thing stops being said once enough people have seen how wrong it was. Nobody announced it gone. It was only that one autumn Birgit realized she had not heard it in a year, and then in 2, and then not at all. And in the 5th winter after the hard winter, Milo Danner climbed the stair to settle the last of what stood between them. And it was the most satisfying quarter hour of Birgit's long life, though not in the way the town would have written it. He was older, grayer, his soft, dangerous voice gone soft only. He had not prospered the way he once expected to. The water suit and the deed challenge and the story of the hired man he would not go out for had followed him too. And a small town has a long memory for the man who was wrong about the woman who was right. He came up on a clear, cold day, alone, and he stood in the outer passage a while, and then he took a folded paper out of his coat and held it out to Birgit, and his hand was not quite steady. It was the original handbill, the one his man had tacked up around town years before, advertising the mill site interest for sale. She had never seen it. She had heard the offer from his own mouth in the recorder's office. But there it was in worn print, the Warm Shadow Mill site, 4 8/10 acres, and the words Danner had chosen to move a thing he wanted gone. Worthless ground, no timber, no sun. Buyer takes all faults. "I kept it," Danner said. "I do not know why. To laugh at, maybe. To laugh at whoever was fool enough to buy it." He looked at the steaming passage, the guarded chamber beyond, the shelf of ledgers, the folding rule on its nail. "I do not laugh at it any more." He was quiet a moment, gathering the thing he had climbed a cliff to say. "I thought I sold you a place no one could live. I have thought that for years, that I got the better of a widow with $5 and a dead outlaw's hole." His jaw worked, the same way Kittredge's had, the same way every proud man's does when the truth is heavier than the pride. You found the one place none of us could afford to lose. I sold it for $5. It is past pricing now, and I am the man who is remembered for letting it go. He pushed the handbill into her hands. Burn it, or keep it. I am done carrying it. Birgit looked at the yellowed paper, at the word worthless in a dead advertisement, and she did not gloat, because she had learned from a dying miner that a thing proven does not need a person to crow over it. She had refused to ruin this man when she could have, and the refusing had cost her nothing and left her larger, and here was the interest on it, paid in full 5 winters late. I will keep it, she said, not to laugh at, to hang. And she did later exactly where it belonged. But first she asked him the only thing she wanted from Milo Danner, which was not an apology and not his money. There is one thing, she said. Ezra Vale, the man you sent into the storm and would not go out for the man I brought back on a rope. She watched Danner flinch at the plain sentence of it, and did not spare him. He is a good hand and a better man than his old employer, and he has climbed this cliff every bad winter since to help pull others up. I want his name on the rescue roster of this place, as a volunteer, in the record, permanent, so that 100 years from now, whoever reads the ledger knows that the man Milo Danner threw away is the man who spent his winters saving the town. She held Danner's eye. You want to be remembered as more than the man who sold it for $5? That is how. Put his name up yourself. Danner put Ezra Vale's name on the roster himself, in his own hand, and it is there in the ledger to this day by the town's telling, and that was the whole of the reckoning between them. There was no ruin, no grand humiliation, no speech. There was only a proud man made to say the truth, and a wronged woman who took, instead of revenge, a good man's name written down in the record where it would outlast them all. It was a better ending than ruin. Ruin would have been over in a season. The name in the ledger is there yet. The warm shadow's way of doing things spread the way water spreads, finding the low places, taking the shape of whatever held it. By the early 90s, 3 settlements within a hard day's ride had built small, warm rooms of their own where the geology allowed it. An old adit here, a warm seep there. None of them a copy of Birgit's cavern, because she would not let them be copies. Every one of them was built to the 4 rules and the diagrams in the public record, with 2 airways and a controlled drain, and sound timber, and a marked spring, and every set of plans that went out from the recorder's office carried Ansel Bream's warnings written in the margins in a hand that had been dead for years and went on teaching anyway. Where the geology did not allow it, Birgit talked people out of it, which was the harder and more important work. She turned away more projects than she blessed. A warm seep in bad rock, a cave with one mouth, a spring with nowhere to drain. She said no to all of them, and said why, and sent the hopeful home to their honest wood, and more than one of them came back years later to thank her for the winter she had made them survive the ordinary way instead of dying the clever way. There was a homesteader named Torkel Assen who tested her on this, and lost, and lived because of it. He had found a warm cave on his own land, up a coulee, and he was a poor man with a sick wife and a hard winter coming, and he climbed the stair to the warm shadow to ask Birgit to come bless his find so he could move his family into it and burn no wood at all. She went. She owed a poor man that much. She sounded his cave wall foot by foot with Ansel's hammer, and she held the smoke low and high, and she found in one afternoon every one of the 4 killers at once. The smoke would not lift, for there was only the one mouth. The roof rang hollow over the very place he meant to lay his children, and the warm water pooled with nowhere to drain but the floor they would sleep on. No, she told him in the cold coulee, and his face went dark with the fear and the anger of a man who has just been told his last hope is a trap. You cannot winter here, not you, not your wife, not one child. This cave has one door and a loose roof and standing water, and it will kill your whole family in their sleep some warm night in February, and you will not even wake to know it did. It is warm, Torkel Asen said, near to weeping. It is warm, and I have no wood and no money, and you have your fine cave in the gorge. And you will have your family alive in a cold cabin, Birgit said, and did not bend an inch, which is worth more than a warm grave. And if you cannot buy wood, then you will come to the warm shadow when the storms come, free, like anyone, because that is what it is for. But you will not move your children into this. I will not bless it. I would rather you hate me and live. He hated her that day. He came back 3 winters on to tell her that a man in the next valley had wintered in a cave just like his and been found dead with his wife and his baby in the spring. All 3, not a mark on them, gone in their sleep on a warm, bad night, and that Torkel Asen had spent those 3 winters in a cold cabin cursing her name and was alive to do it. He did not curse her after that. That was what she became known for in the end, not the discovery. Anyone, she said, could have felt the warm rock. She had only been the one desperate enough to climb to it, and lucky enough to have a father who taught her to read it, and a dying man who taught her to keep it from killing her. What she became known for was the word no. The woman who would tell you flatly that your clever warm shelter was a grave, and make you angry, and be right, and save your life by refusing you. In a country full of men selling schemes, Birgit Stensland built a reputation on the schemes she would not sell. She lived out her life above the gorge that had nearly been her grave, in a small timber house she built herself on the high ground where the afternoon sun came full and warm through real windows, because a woman who has spent a winter in a cave earns the right to a house with the sun in it. She never married. The town's speculation on that point wore out long before she did. Her life was the enterprise, and the enterprise was 2 women. Birgit kept the rock and the water and the air. Nell Brackett kept the people and the provisions and the count, and between them they made one whole thing that neither could have made alone, the way a cap timber and 2 posts make one set that holds a mountain, and no single piece holds anything. They did not speak of it as friendship most days. They spoke of wedges and beans and lamp oil, and whose turn it was to run the drill. But on a slow, warm evening in the wash house, wringing sheets side by side, the way Birgit had once wrung them for wages, Nell said once without looking up, "You know we are the only 2 people either of us has left." And Birgit said, "I know it." And that was the whole of the conversation, and it was enough, and they went back to the sheets. 24 years they ran the warm shadow between them, the cook and the widow, 2 women who had each buried a family and found in a cursed gorge a reason to bury nothing else of themselves. Nell died in the winter of 1912, in her own bed, old and finished with her work, and Birgit kept the vigil the way she kept everything, without a wasted motion and without a tear anyone saw. She did not close the warm shadow for it. Nell would have been furious to be the reason a warm door was shut in January. Instead, Birgit did the truer thing, the thing she had learned to do for the dead the day she carried Ansel's diagrams down to the recorder. She took up Nell's ledger, the shelf of ledgers now in that square, hard hand, and she taught the next keeper to rule the columns exactly as Nell had ruled them, and to boil the water exactly as Nell had ordered it, and to count the souls exactly as Nell had counted them, so that a woman dead of old age went on portioning the winter and guarding the sick for years after her heart stopped in the discipline she had built and would not let die. Birgit had buried a husband and a mentor, and now a friend, and each time she had answered the grave the same way, not with a monument, but by refusing to let the work go into it with the body. The dead, she had decided long ago, are best honored by the living thing they leave running. Every autumn, into her old age, Before she would trust one word of any inspector's report, Birgit Stensland went down the stair herself, slower every year, and walked the inner chamber, and laid her own hand on the support wedges one by one, the way her father had laid his hand on quarry rock, feeling for the truth under the grit. She trusted the ledger. She trusted her people. But once a year, on the wedges that held the roof over the room where the town had come to live, she trusted only her own hand. In the 1920s, when Birgit was an old woman with white hair and a stick, a man near 60 climbed the stair to see her, and behind him came a small girl by the hand. The man had been a boy of 9 in the shelter in 1887, one of the widower's 3 children, and he had brought his granddaughter 14 miles to show her the place that had kept his family alive before her mother's mother was born. He read her the list of 23 names on the vestibule wall. He showed her the yellow deed and the word grave someone had once put on it. And Birgit, too old now to climb, but not too old to teach, took the child by the hand and led her to the low pipe by the inner door and made her kneel and put her small fingers over it and feel the cold, clean air coming in, and then made her find it again with her eyes shut, the way every child at the warm shadow had been made to for 40 years. Never block this, the old woman told the little girl in the same flat words she had once used on a frightened teamster on the worst night of her life. Not for warmth, not for anything. Air first. You remember that, and you can save a room full of people someday. The child remembered it. She was still telling it to children of her own long after Birgit was gone, which is the only kind of forever a person really gets. She was 72 years old when she died in 1938, in the house with the afternoon sun, and the cooperative ledger recorded her passing not as the discoverer of a miracle, but by the title she had earned and kept for 50 years, longest-serving inspector, warm shadow refuge. It was, of every honor the town tried to give her over the years, the only one she ever accepted, because it was the only one that was true, and Birgit Stensland had built a whole life on refusing the ones that were not. The warm shadow never became the paradise the town's stories made of it. It stayed exactly what she and Ansel had built, and no more, a wet, difficult place that kept people alive only so long as someone honored the discipline of it. 2 open airways, an unobstructed drain, sound timber, clean water, a marked spring, accounted occupancy, and a person willing to check all of it before the storm and not after. 3 nearby settlements copied portions of her system where their rock allowed, and more learned the harder lesson she taught with the word no, that no warmth ever justified entering ground that could not breathe or drain or hold. Her diagrams outlived her in the public record, and Ansel Bream's warnings outlived them both in the margins, and somewhere in that county, on some cold night long after, a family cleared 2 exits in the dark by feel because a child had once learned it as game. She had lived her later years in the small house on the high ground where the sun came full through the windows. A laundress who ended with her name on a shelf of ledgers, and a folding rule she had earned by correcting the man who gave it to her. Each autumn, until she could no longer manage the stair, she went down into the gorge alone and laid her bare hand on the wedges that held the roof, trusting no report but the one her own palm gave her. When she died in the winter of 1938, 72 years old, the survivors of survivors carried her name down out of the gorge the way, half a century before, a handful of frozen strangers had carried it down through a blizzard as the thing that had kept them alive. On the October morning she bought the claim, with $5.80 to her name and a nailed-shut wash-house behind her. Orson Kittredge had watched her lay $5 silver on the recorder's desk and told her, in front of laughing men, the sentence that followed her all that first hard winter. "You paid $5 for a grave with a deed." The deed hung, in the end, framed inside the outer vestibule of the warm shadow, its paper gone yellow, the ink faded around the parcel lines. Beneath it hung a thermometer, a vent check card, and a list of 23 names, the souls sheltered through the hard winter of 1887, 22 of whom walked back down the cliff alive. Outside, frost still filled every shaded crack in Black Glass Gorge, as it always had, as it always would. But where the exhaust rays broke through the cliff face, a thin thread of warm vapor rose into the cold and curled over the words of the deed and disappeared into the daylight. The grave had never been warm enough by itself to save a single soul. Birgit Stensland had taught it how to breathe,